Hi, and welcome to today's Engaging for Missouri webinar. I'm Alice Roach from the University of Missouri, and I'll be your host today. With each of these 30-minute webinars, we intend to share research-based insights that leaders like you can apply in your own work to benefit and strengthen the state's agriculture and food system, hospitality sector, economy, communities, and families. Today, Dr. Mike Sykuta joins us to speak about who decides how much you pay for heating and cooling. Before I invite him to begin, I want to share a few housekeeping notes. First, we'll close today with a Q&A session. Those of you who connected today via your computers may submit your questions in the chat screen. If you joined today by phone, then you may email me your questions at roacham@missouri.edu. Second, all attendees are muted and may not start their video. Third, if you encounter any technical problems during today's presentation, then you can let me know by either submitting a comment in the chat screen, or you can send me an email at roacham@missouri.edu, and I'll do my best to help you troubleshoot. And last, we'll make a recording of today's presentation available. You can look for an email tomorrow that shares more about where you can access that recording. And you can also find an archive of all of our previous Engaging for Missouri webinars on our Division of Applied Social Sciences YouTube channel. So now we'll transition to the topic of today's presentation, which is titled, Who Sets My Utility Bill? Presenting today is Dr. Mike Sykuta, who's an associate professor of agricultural and applied economics at the University of Missouri, and he also serves as the executive director of Mizzou's Financial Research Institute. So thanks, Mike, for presenting today. If you could please unmute your microphone and start your video, then we can begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Alice. This is exciting to have the opportunity to present this. And as we get started, I want to offer several caveats. This topic is much more complicated than we're going to be able to do today. And it's going to talk specifically about pricing and the prices of energy, think natural gas and electric in particular. And the idea for today's seminar, when Alice first asked me about doing one of these, I had seen someone post on social media from the St. Louis area, actually, ranting about their utility prices and saying that we ought to have the city take over our utility so it will be run in the public interest. And it occurred to me at the time that obviously people really don't understand how this process works and who's setting the prices and how that works. So that's kind of what today's seminar is focused on. To get started, just a little bit about FRI, the Financial Research Institute. It was created in 1988 to foster an environment where utility regulators, utility industry people, and consumer advocates and scholars could come together and talk about issues facing regulated industries. So part of what FRI does is host interactive forums for consumers, regulators, industry, and educators to have these kinds of conversations about things that are facing the industry and facing the regulatory environment to help hopefully foster better decision making. So that's a little bit about FRI, and you can find out more about us at fri.missouri.edu. So to really start the topic, we need to first think about how does the energy get to your house. So again, I'm going to focus today on natural gas and electricity. I know much of the state, especially for doesn't have natural gas necessarily and uses propane, and that's a very different market system than natural gas and electricity. So I'm going to focus on these two. And as you think about how that electricity or that natural gas gets to your house, it has to be produced somewhere. In the case of natural gas, in gas and oil fields, it's extracted. There are natural gas pipelines that crisscross the United States for interstate transmission. That natural gas gets pulled into local distribution systems that are run by local distributors and shipped to your house through the pipes. On the electric side, we have a very similar process when you think about it. We have generation, much like the electric or the natural gas production. And we normally think about coal-fired plants. We have nuclear plants in Missouri. There are plants that are fueled by natural gas. You see the gas-powered generation in the natural gas supply chain. And now we have increasingly solar and wind power as part of those generation assets. And all of that electricity is aggregated, put onto transmission lines, transmitted to local communities, decompressed, and then distributed to your local house through the wires that connect to your house. And we have some companies that are vertically integrated. So we have companies that have generation assets, transmission, and distribution. I think some large companies like Ameren and Evergy, for instance, on the electric side. And we have a lot on the electric side of distribution companies. So most rural electric co-ops don't really own much generation, but they're buying electricity from the transmission grid and then distributing it through their local community. And there are municipalities that may be one or the other. Here in Columbia, we do have a city-owned power plant, but we also buy electricity from the grid and the city manages the distribution network. Other cities might just buy the electricity off the grid and not really own any generation. So it's different in every environment. But what's true about both of these in the large scale is if we think about these energy utilities, they're characterized by really high fixed costs. You know, there's a lot of capital investment in terms of generation, transmission, and distribution equipment that really doesn't change no matter how much energy is going over the lines, right? Or how much gas is going through the pipe. The pipe is there regardless. The wires are there regardless. You know, it's what in economics we would call a fixed cost. The actual production and transmission of the energy is relatively low cost on a per kilowatt hour or a cubic foot of gas level. If we think about how much of the cost of the gas or the electricity is these real high fixed assets versus the variable costs of producing them, the variable costs are really low, whereas the fixed costs are really high. And that gives us an environment where we have what in economics we talk about significant economies of scale, where the average cost of producing goes down the bigger you are because you're able to spread the cost of those fixed assets over more and more consumers or more and more volume. So that's kind of the nature of these energy utilities in general. Water is the same way if we think about public drinking water, and it follows a similar pricing structure in terms of the regulated prices. So if we think about the economics of utilities, just kind of to summarize, we have those high fixed costs, we have low operating or variable costs, and we have significant economies of scale, which relative to the size of the market means it may be true that having one large operator, they can service the entire market at a lower average cost than if we had two or more. So in that kind of a situation, we have what in economics we call natural monopolies. And when we have a natural monopoly, it actually makes economic sense to have only one firm, to allow there to be a monopoly, because that's the most economically efficient way of servicing the market. Now, when we talk about monopolies, you know, we see these talked about in the popular press recently. The big question then is, but aren't monopolies bad? You know, we hear monopolies are bad all the time. But here we have a case where we might actually like there to be monopolies to provide natural gas and electricity, drinking water, and certain other types of utility type products. So the trade-off is this: we make them public utilities. And what we mean by public utilities is, in order to get the economic benefits of having a natural monopoly, we actually give them the legal right to be a monopoly. So we pass laws that make it so that a particular company has a monopoly over a particular area. I live in the city of Columbia. It is illegal for me to get residential electric utility or electricity from anybody other than the city of Columbia. They have a monopoly in their territory. Similar with Ameren, similar with your electric co-op. The operating entity is given a monopoly to serve its particular service area. But in exchange for getting the monopoly, they're subject to public oversight. So in the case of investor-owned utilities, think Ameren, Evergy, Liberty Utilities, Empire Gas. Now, these are companies that are regulated by the State Public Service Commission. So these are privately owned companies. They have shareholders, and to balance the interest of the shareholders and the consumers, the State Public Service Commission has say on what they're allowed to charge and what they're allowed to charge for, right? But we have other public utilities, some that are run by municipalities, like here in the city of Columbia. Columbia runs its own electric company. The city electric and water is provided by the city government, but we get our natural gas from Ameren. Other municipalities may offer natural gas service, they may offer electric. And in those cases, it's publicly overseen by the city council, right? So it's run by the public. It's, you know, it's a government entity. It doesn't have the same kind of incentives that an investor-owned firm might have. And it's overseen by the city council or whomever the elected officials are for that municipality. Rural electric cooperatives are similar in the sense that they don't have the same incentive system. They don't have shareholders in the sense that an investor-owned firm does. The cooperative is owned by its customer owners. It's overseen by elected board members. So the incentives of the organization are a little bit different. But it's still overseen by the people it serves. In the case of the co-ops, we elect board members from the customer base. Those people oversee the management, and part of what they do is help set what the prices should be. So when we talk about public utilities, there's really three kinds. And which one you get depends on where you live. And therefore, who sets your utility bill depends on where you live. Now, I know you can't see the fine details on this map, and I'm not so worried about that. I downloaded these from the Public Service Commission website. That's psc.missouri.gov if you're interested in going and looking yourself. But on the left map, you see this is the natural gas pipelines in the state of Missouri. And you'll see they're color coded. On the gas side, the orange pipelines and nodes around, especially coming around the St. Louis area and across here, are Ameren. Dark green is Liberty Utility. Purple and magenta are Spire, both on the east and west side of the state. Green is Summit Natural Gas, down here in the southern part of the state. And then there are municipalities that have their own natural gas. Some of these black dots in various counties around the state are served by municipality-owned natural gas companies. Now, the PSC regulates safety of natural gas pipelines no matter who owns them. But pricing is a different story, right? The municipals get to price their own natural gas. The investor-owned firms, it's overseen by the PSC. The map on the right is the electric service areas. So the yellow is Ameren, Ameren Electric. The green and gray on the west side of the state is Evergy. The blue in the southwest part of the state is Empire District Gas or District Electric. The black dots in various parts are the black blobs. You see in the middle of Boone County, there's the big black square. That's Columbia's municipal electric facility. Down in Greene County, Springfield has their own electric facility. That's the big block down in Greene County. And then the white parts of the state are served by rural cooperatives. So, Laclede Gas, Boone County, Laclede County Co-op, Boone County Co-op. There's co-ops all around the state that distribute electricity to their members and especially rural parts of the state. So who sets your utility bill depends on where you live. And you don't really have a choice. The PSC does allow you to ask to change, but that's very rare and unlikely to happen for residential utilities, more so maybe for industrial. So what goes into the pricing? Where do these prices come from? Especially, I'm going to talk now about the regulated prices. So this is thinking about investor-owned firms. The problem is similar for municipals and co-ops. The math is a little bit different in terms of what the values might look like. But basically, we have what's called a rate of return regulation. We're going to give the investors the right to be a monopolist. We're going to give the investors a right to earn a reasonable profit. But reasonable is in the eye of the beholder, right? So how do we determine what a reasonable profit is? Well, we use what's called a rate of return regulation. What's a reasonable rate of return that investors in a utility should expect to receive? And how much revenue would it take for the utility to generate that level of return? That's kind of the basic starting point on these pricing problems, is what's a reasonable revenue requirement that would cover the cost of service and also give the investors a reasonable rate of return to reward them for investing the assets that allow for the development of all the infrastructure and the operation of the firm. So, this is kind of a standard formula that would be used in calculating kind of these cost of service or revenue requirement models, where we have the rate base, what's the capital that's invested, and how much does it cost to fund that capital? So if we think about the revenue requirement that we have times the cost of capital to fund, or I'm sorry, the base rate that we have and the cost of capital it takes to fund that rate base. Then we have our operating and maintenance expenses, those kind of variable costs as we run the business. We have depreciation expenses as the value of some of that infrastructure is written off over time. And then we have taxes that aren't part of the operating expenses that get deducted from the income of the company before the return to the investors happens. So there's an accounting for really what does the top line have to be in order to get a certain rate of return for investors. And this is where that formula comes from. So in addition to the rate of return regulation, there's might be other objectives that policymakers would have in determining how rates are set. So if you think about it, we figured out how much money has to come in, but who pays how much is a different part of the equation, right? So first is how much money do we have to generate? And then is how do we generate it from different types of users in different situations with different kind of objectives from a policy perspective. So for instance, we might have programs to make energy more affordable for low and moderate income households. So if we're going to charge a lower price for certain segments, we need to charge a higher price somewhere else to make up the difference, right? We may have incentives for energy efficiency. Some areas might set prices in a way to discourage consuming more electricity. Some might set prices in a way that don't discourage higher volumes of electricity, for instance. There may be incentives for investing in energy efficiency technology, that if you invest so much here, then you get some to capture some of that reward. There are objectives about balancing load. We know that electricity tends to peak in the middle of the day, and then it kind of bounces back up again during prime time of the evening. But early evening, middle of the night, electricity consumption tends to be pretty low. So how can we shift consumption of electricity between time periods, for instance? That might affect the way we price the electricity. And then we may have environmental and renewable energy goals, especially as we talk about increased electrification in the United States, as we worry about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change issues. We may try and build incentives into the pricing structure that are associated with some of these environmental objectives. So there's two parts of the equation. How much money has to come in to keep the utility operating? How do we set the rates in a way that not only covers those revenues, but deals with some of these other policy objectives while still covering those revenues? Some examples of what that might look like: some utilities have flat rates, right? Same price of electricity anytime you use it, no matter how much you use it. More often, there's some kind of a block rate. So for a certain number of kilowatt hours, you pay one price. If you get to a different level of kilowatt hours, you pay a different price. If you consume the first so many units of natural gas, you pay one price. If you go above that, you pay a different price. We may also use time of use rates. So we charge a higher price during peak demand periods. We charge a lower price in off-peak demand periods, partly as a way of encouraging people to shift their behavior. Instead of using electricity when the cost of electricity is really high, maybe you do your laundry at a different time of day. Instead of charging your electric vehicle in the middle of the day, you charge your electric vehicle overnight. And we try and use prices, time of use rates, to encourage that. And another type of pricing that we see in some places, I'm not sure how much it's experienced in Missouri, are real-time prices, where the price that you pay for a kilowatt hour of electricity in particular is based on the actual price of electricity at that point of the day, which might bounce all over the place on any given day. So instead of a block of time of use rate, where it's a certain price during a certain window of time, it's whatever the price is at that point in time. So because the wholesale market for electricity is different than the retail market for electricity. So how are the rates set for these regulated utilities? So this is where that whole monopoly and serving the public interest thing comes in. The way the Public Service Commission generally, the rate cases work is the monopoly come in and proposes new rates. They have to justify what prices and what rates ought to be. They have to make a formal proposal to the state commission. The Public Service Commission staff, there's a staff of professionals who evaluate that proposal. They make recommendations about whether they think it's reasonable or not, what they think alternatives might be. And there may be even some negotiating between them in the process. And then there's also an Office of Public Counsel at the state of Missouri that represents consumer interests. In other states, it might be called the Office of Consumer Advocate. All three of these parties present their case or their perspective to the Public Service Commission. And it's very much like a court. And in fact, the language of courts is very much like this. A docket is filed. There are limitations on who can talk to whom under what circumstances. And then the PSC Commission, which is made up of appointed people, the governor appoints and the Senate confirms members of the Missouri Public Service Commission, serve as the ruling body, and they determine what they believe is the right answer in terms of the reasonable rates. And that's how the rates get set. And it's a rather long and costly process for everybody involved, but that's really where your prices come from if you're dealing with one of these investor-owned utilities. So what about municipals and co-ops? How does that work? Well, it's the same basic formula and it's the same basic process. Some of the financial constraints are different, but the basic idea is the same. And the process is somewhat the same. The utility manager has to decide that we need to charge new prices, and they have to make a case that we need to change the rates that we charge. Especially in municipalities, there might be a consumer commission that evaluates that proposal, and they offer their perspective from the consumer side to have the consumer's view recommended. And then the elected public officials in the case of the municipality, or the board members in the case of the co-op, act as the final decision makers. So they're the ones that are providing that public oversight that make it a public utility. Right? So what's common for everyone? No matter where you are in Missouri, you're being served by a monopoly, whether it's natural gas or electric. So when we talk about, well, I wish I didn't have a monopoly giving me my utility, that's not going to change. You have a monopoly, and it's just a matter of how it's governed. Right, all the utilities have to ensure enough revenue to cover their cost of service, whether they're vertically integrated or whether they're just in transmission or distribution. We have to pay enough to make the investments and to make the investments worthwhile, no matter who's making those investments. And we have to cover the cost of operations. And then all prices are set and approved by an oversight committee that is charged with serving the public interest. So whether it's an investor-owned firm, whether it's a municipality, whether it's a co-op, the charge of the oversight committee is the customer or public interest and making sure that customers are being charged reasonable prices for the utility service they get. So there may be differences in the details given the different ownership and capital characteristics, but the basics of the pricing problem are very similar across these different types of organizations. And finally, there may be differences in outcomes given how the different types of oversight structures may work. Right? Different entities may have different objectives. The City of Columbia tends to be very conservation minded, and they adopt rate structures that are very different than other consumers might experience, for instance. But that's a policy decision, right? So although the process is pretty much the same, outcomes may be different depending on the objectives of the people who are setting the prices. And that's really what it comes down to, is what's the cost of service? What are our policy objectives in terms of how we want this stuff priced? And then how do we set prices to accomplish both of those at the same time? So with that, I'll thank you for your time. This contact information for FRI if you want to follow some of the broader stuff we're doing. And with that, Alice, whatever questions we may have.
Yes, thank you, Mike. We do have some time for questions. If you haven't already added your question to the chat screen, then please do that. Or you can also send your question via email to me at roacham@missouri.edu. Mike, our first question is about alternative energy. And our attendee writes, do economies of scale tend to be an optimal way to go in alternative energy generation, such as solar panels? She's specifically curious about the large-scale solar energy generation projects where they lease extensive land to generate extensive energy that utilities can then use.
So there are economies of scale in the sense that if we have a whole bunch of solar panels in one place, it's a lot easier and a lot less expensive to get the electricity from those solar panels into the grid network. One of the challenges with more distributed energy generation, think rooftop solar, And some places that have net metering of rooftop solar where households can sell their electricity back into the grid, they have to make adjustments for all of these different individual households all over the network, potentially feeding electricity into the grid. And that can become more costly and difficult to manage. Having large solar farms, there are certainly cost economies there in terms of aggregating all of that technologically anyway. There are certainly some cost economies there.
Great, thanks. The next question is also about net metering, as you mentioned earlier. So even though utilities are paying for electricity from utility customers in that net metering example, is it effectively viewed as a net neutral impact on their bottom line as they're able to sell that electricity back to other utilities?
It actually might help them because it reduces the amount of generation capacity they might need for a peak time. Right, so they may need less peak capacity, peak generation capacity, or they may need to buy less off the grid, depending on the nature of the utility. There are some potential economies to the utility. Now, part of the debate in net metering is what price should the consumer or prosumer be paid when they sell electricity back into the grid. Some are set on kind of the cost of I forget the technical term offhand, but essentially, if I don't have to go into the wholesale market, or if I don't have to, the cost avoidance, right? Well, the wholesale price is not the retail price. So if I had to buy more at wholesale and my alternative is to take it from you, should I give you the wholesale price? Or if I'm selling it at retail, should I give you the retail price? And that's a point that's been debated and not settled, and there are different policies in different parts of the country as to how that price is actually set.
Great, thank you. You mentioned that utilities are monopolies. So how is consolidation of utilities handled? How big can these utility monopolies become?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Technically, when we think about monopolies and mergers being a problem, typically the merger problem is we eliminate competition. Well, since there isn't any competition in the first place, having a monopoly take over a larger territory doesn't necessarily reduce any competition. So the merger conversation does get rather different. Frequently, what will happen is, well, I don't want to get into too much, say too much more than I actually know a lot, because I haven't studied a lot of the details on some of these mergers. But there are issues about ability to serve. There are issues about, on the flip side of the monopoly is the monopsony side. So we may have no competition at the retail side, but there may be competition for different kinds of services on the input side. And having one big firm might change some of that. So there may be other kinds of competition concerns that we wouldn't normally think of with these mergers. But it really would depend on the particular entities that are merging and what the potential implications are.
Great, thank you. So how often do utilities reassess the rates that they charge? So if costs that are incurred to provide the service either increase or decrease, how soon before consumers see an adjustment in their utility bills?
Oh boy, I can't give you a good answer on that. I'm not sure. I know very frequently in different utilities in different sectors. So, water is different than electric, is different than natural gas. They can be rather different. Some may be a long time between rates, water especially, where they may wait a long time between asking for a new rate because going through the process is pretty expensive. When input costs tends to be more volatile, natural gas and electric, we might see that happen more frequently, where we would get some kind of adjustment in response to some of those input cost changes. And it really just kind of depends on what those input cost markets are behaving like.
Sure, thanks. We have time for one more question, and this is an attendee question. Is there evidence that deregulated electricity markets like Illinois perform differently than Missouri's regulated market environment?
There have been some studies. I haven't read, I can't think of one off the top of my head. There have been some studies that have looked at some of the deregulated electric markets compared to regulated markets. And what tends to happen is it's the electricity, it's the electrons or the molecules that are deregulated, right? So I may get to choose who's generating my electricity, and I can buy from them based on the price that they offer, but then I still have to pay the transmission and distribution people for using their assets to get the electrons to my house, right? So even in those competitive deregulated markets, there's still a regulated aspect in terms of transmission costs. And what's really being deregulated is buying the electrons. There are some differences there. There are consumers that do get cost savings. There are consumers that choose to buy more expensive electrons because they want electrons that are created in a particular way, green or renewable electrons. So there are differences in some aspects of how that works. And I know there's research out there, but I couldn't point to anything in particular to give you a definitive comparison.
Great, thank you. Well, it's time to close today's webinar. Thanks, Mike, for presenting and for taking our questions. And thanks to our audience for joining us. When you exit Zoom today, you'll see a post-webinar survey will load in your browser. Please consider responding, as we'll use the results to improve the webinar experience and also brainstorm future webinar topics. Again, you should receive a recorded copy of today's presentation and the slides via email within about a day from now. You can join us on March 9th for our next Engaging for Missouri webinar. Dr. Sarah Lowe will speak about the new Rural and Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center that's based at the University of Missouri. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope you have a great Wednesday. Thanks again, Mike.
Thanks.